One of my favorite movies of all time is Black Panther. And I'm really excited about this fall and the coming Black Panther movie to follow the first one. Black Panther is one of my favorite movies because it is such a powerful depiction of Wakanda and its resources, its beauty, its exceptional ingenuity. It's just fascinating to me. And in this movie, I think there is an overlooked scene that I think is a significant key to the entire story. It's after everyone thinks that King T'Challa, who is now being challenged by Killmonger to get the throne of Wakanda, they think that Killmonger has killed King T'Challa. And so this devastates everyone, particularly his mother and his sister. And so King T'Challa's mother and sister, they go to look for help, and they go and engage with Lord M'Baku. And they ask him for help. M'Baku is the leader of one of the tribes of Wakanda, but it is the only tribe that is an outlier. It's not united with all of the other tribes. And it's interesting because M'Baku and King T'Challa had their own battle, and Lord M'Baku loses, and it just so happens that King T'Challa is not dead, and that the tribe that M'Baku leads finds him, and it is M'Baku who says, "Keep him alive." And so when King T'Challa's mother and sister come to Lord M'Baku, they find that King T'Challa is alive. M'Baku basically saves his life despite losing the challenge to King T'Challa, and despite having a completely different agenda for Wakanda than King T'Challa. M'Baku shows deference to King T'Challa as an act of humility. And is that intentional decision, when M'Baku is now in a seat of power, in a seat of authority, is that intentional decision that shifts the entire movie. And King T'Challa is now resurrected, and the game is over. Well, I want to continue the series that we've been in called Selfless, which is an examination of what it means to be humble. This examination of humility. And this week, I want to take another look at what it means to live out this virtue of humility in our lives, particularly when we're in a place of power or a place of influence or a place of authority and our enemies are present. Last week, we talked about humility being our identity. Jesus does something very strange. He hears this conversation or engages this conversation with his disciples about greatness, and he calls a child to the front, and he says, basically, this is the picture of what it means to be great, to make yourself nothing because a child had zero worth in the ancient world, to make yourself dependent because a child can't thrive in life without the help of a parent or a guardian, yet they have the opportunity to live carefree. This is the example that Jesus gives. But my question this week, as we take the baton from last week and we continue on this week, my question is, what does humility look like when you have power, influence, and authority? I think Jesus gives us another significant and challenging teaching in John 13. He's hanging out with his disciples. He knows that his time is drawing near. He's got to do what he's got to do. And so let's pick this up in John chapter number 13. You can meet me there. We'll start in verse number 2. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. We'll have the words on the screen behind me. And I'm reading from the CSB version. So here we go. Now when it was time for supper, the devil had already put into the heart of Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, to betray him. Jesus knew that the Father had given everything into his hands, that he had come from God, and that he was going back to God. So he got up from supper. He laid aside his outer clothing. He took a towel and tied it around himself. Next, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to dry them with the towel tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who asked him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus answered him, "What I'm doing, you don't realize now, but afterward you will understand." "You will never wash my feet," Peter said. Jesus replied, "If I don't wash you, you have no part with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." "One who has bathed," Jesus said, "doesn't need to wash anything except his feet, but he is completely clean. You are clean, but not all of you." For he knew who would betray him. This is why he said, "Not all of you are clean." When Jesus had washed their feet and put on his outer clothing, he reclined again and he said to them, "Do you not know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are speaking rightly, since that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done." Last week, I used for a subject, humility should be our identity for those of us who follow Jesus. This week, I just want to continue kind of in that same vein with this little subject. Humility has to be intentional. Humility has to be intentional. This scene that we just read in John 13 happens to be, in my opinion, one of the top 5 scenes in all of the New Testament. The disciples in this moment are completely stunned. They don't really understand here, like what is happening. What is Jesus doing? And Peter, who's always the one to speak up, Peter always has something to say. You know, it's one of those in every group. Peter is like, "Jesus, you can't be washing my feet," because Peter understands that this is not the role of a king, not the role of someone in authority or someone who has all power. Someone of no reputation is the person that's supposed to be washing someone's feet. It's a servant's job. But he's showing the disciples yet again what greatness looks like and what greatness does. If we flash back to last week when we were talking about humility being our identity, there's no way that we can really walk this out in our lives. There's no way that we can actually reflect and exemplify humility without significant security in who we are and where we take our cues from. This is why Jesus said in John, or why it's stated, in John 13:3, that Jesus knew he had all power. He wasn't confused about who he was and the power that he had. And he wasn't confused where he came from. He was secure in his identity. And then if you read through the Gospel of John, 11 different times it says that Jesus talked about, "No, this is not my will. The glory is not about me. Listen, I'm taking my cues from my Father." When I was growing up, my parents, who I believe are just great teachers and great examples for me, and I'm always aspiring to live up to the expectation that my parents set for me. And I always remember these things that they would say from time to time. And one of their phrases for me, whenever I was going to leave the house or I was going to leave their presence, they would say things like, "Know who you are and whose you are." What my parents were trying to help me understand is that I didn't have to live or move or make decisions outside of the identity that I had been given, and that I could be secure in that, and I needed to always remember that. And that's part of what it means to be humble, is to have some level of security and to have a level of authenticity that we embrace about ourselves. There's a speaker that I follow right now. His name is Ryan Leake, and he's a phenomenal communicator. He does training, corporate trainings, but he's also a teaching pastor. And I was listening to him on a podcast as I was taking a walk this week, and he said, one of the number one things that I've found that people struggle with and why they can't show up well is because they struggle with their authenticity. We will always be tempted to flex and not show vulnerability because it looks like weakness. It looks like insecurity. And that's why it's a struggle sometimes to be humble, to live out this virtue, to make ourselves of a low position, because it just looks like we're putting ourselves in an insecure place. So then the question is that I have for us as we kind of zoom in on what we see happening here in John 13 is this. What are we to gain from what we see Jesus doing? Is this just a nice story that we listen to, maybe we teach our kids? But how do we apply this? Well, what are we supposed to learn? I'm so glad you asked. You guys are such an engaging audience. Thank you. I knew you would ask this, and so I have two things that I just want us to consider, and these will be my 2 points if you're taking notes. Number one, humility has to be intentional. Remember, that's the subject of this message. Humility has to be intentional when and wherever we have influence. Now, some of us might be saying, I don't really believe I have influence. I don't really believe I have authority. Well, you have some level of influence. You have some level of authority in some way. It presents itself throughout our lives every single day. No, we might not be in a position of power according to the culture, but we all have the opportunity to influence. And we live in this age where people are trying to get more and more and more influence. We live in the age of influencers, or so many are self-proclaimed influencers. And the intentionality around that is usually to feed an agenda about self. It's to feed something about us or some specific agenda for us. And this is in part why what Jesus is doing and what he is saying is so confusing. You have to understand that in this particular day, they wore sandals. They didn't have Jordans and Pumas and all these things we're wearing. So they had dusty feet, y'all. I mean, in that part of the world, very dry and arid climate. And so this was the footwear that they wore. And so people's feet would just get dirty. And so either you would wash your own feet if you went to someone's house, or if the person was affluent and they had a little money, there was a servant that would wash the person's feet. And the servant would be the lowest ranking person in the house. So in a culture that celebrates rank, and then we also pursue notoriety because that gives us preferential treatment, Jesus is saying, pursue the opposite. And so this idea of humility has to be intentional, because the expectation of our culture and the thirst of our culture is actually opposite. It's going in a completely different direction. And if we're not careful and we're not being intentional with trying to live out this virtue, we will get caught up as well into power and position, and then elevate ourselves or think of ourselves over other people. I think Peter, who is a very interesting character as you read through the Gospels, he was a little bit of a loose cannon. But I think Peter learned a little something after Jesus' death, a little bit later on. I think some of these things began to crystallize what he experienced with Jesus. And I believe this to be the case because when you read what he wrote, and we're going to look at 1 Peter 5, verse 5 and 6, listen to what he says here. Peter's instructions: clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God resists the proud. Remember, Jesus said, if I don't do this, you have no part of me. That's the resistance of pride right there. He says, God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you at the proper time. There's a book, and you can write this down. It's a great book. It's called The Blessing of Humility by Jerry Bridges. And what Jerry Bridges says about this specific text here is, he says that there's a precept and a promise. And so the precept means that this is a command. So clothe yourselves. Like, we wouldn't think about leaving our home without clothes. It's a necessity in the world that we live in. So this whole idea of commanding ourselves to clothe, literally, intentionally put on clothes like we put on clothes every day. We are to intentionally put on humility. So this is the command, but following the command, there is a promise. And the promise is that God will give grace. Grace is often synonymous with power, and it also goes on to talk about how God is the one who exalts. So promotion comes from God. This is awesome for us to understand because our culture, their exaltation of us or anyone, it always falls short. There's always a catch. There's always a caveat, and it's always fleeting. And it always has to do with if culture is pleased with you. But your heavenly Father is always pleased with you. So his exaltation is what we want to pursue. So number one, humility has to be intentional when and wherever you have influence. Secondly, and this is my favorite point, humility has to be intentional with both friends and enemies. It's interesting here that Jesus kind of pauses in the middle of this discourse and makes notes that, listen, everybody ain't clean. Somebody in here, you know, they got bad intentions. And I just want to make it known that I know that one of y'all has it out for me. And we know it's Judas, and verse 2 indicates that. It's later confirmed in the story. He's the one who betrays Jesus. But what's striking to me is that this is a room, this is an intimate setting. This is a room of close friends. They're all Jesus' friends. Yes, he is Lord, but he has said, and this is in the scriptures as well, I also call you friends. So these are his closest friends, the closest people to him. They've been walking with him for 3 years, yet there's somebody in the room that is posing as a friend, but is really an enemy. Is really a backstabber. Yet, Jesus still takes a servant's position, washes his friend's feet, and the one he knows is actually an enemy. See, I'm not even going to act like this ain't hard. I'm not going to act like this not hard. I mean, we all know people. We might have a person in mind right now who we don't like. They are a problem, and you don't want to even be in their presence, let alone humble yourself and do something nice for them. Maybe it's just me. I'm just being honest. See, this right here is where we need this grace of God that Jerry Bridges is talking about. Because this is not how we respond to backstabbers. This is not how we respond to people that we know don't mean us any good. As a matter of fact, you can't be in my circle. You got to get out my circle immediately. Listen, I know my heart. I know my mouth. and I know that I'm not that good. So when Peter is saying put on humility every day, as I got to do that. I love what Everett Worthington Jr. says, who wrote the book Humility, the Quiet Virtue. This is what he says. He says, when we are wronged, it is easy to feel morally superior. That is why we dehumanize people we wish to hurt. We want to exact revenge without seeing their similarity to us. So that means that we all have a Judas potential. We all have the same kind of potential. So we can't start acting like we holier than thou, like the potential ain't in us. And it hadn't been demonstrated from us. But it doesn't mean that, when we see these things that we don't call them out. We don't speak truth. We don't confront. This is what Jesus does. But Jesus does so in humility, or while still displaying humility. And he goes the extra mile and still washes Judas's feet. So when we hit the rewind button and we read where Jesus says, love your enemies and bless those who curse you, he wasn't just talking about it, he was being about it. And he even says that what significance is it if you just cool with people who cool with you? I mean, everybody does that. What makes you different? And Jesus was making this point because he's trying to show us and he's trying to talk to us about, hey, listen, my version or my idea of what the kingdom of heaven is, it doesn't look like this place. It looks like something different. And what I'm calling you to is something different. And then he intentionally humbles himself daily. And then he demonstrates for us what this looks like. Let me bring this in for a landing for us today. I was reading this article in Inc. magazine, one of my favorite magazines. It's a business magazine. It's really for entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial minds. And there was an article in 2017 by a guy named Chris Desi, and it was about power. And the title really caught my attention. It said, "How to Be the Most Powerful Person in the Room." And I thought, wow, this is quite interesting. And I was skeptical at first, very skeptical, because I'm like, I don't know what the angle here is, so I got to read and see what was happening. I was pleasantly surprised, and it was a short article, but the conclusion of the article was this: that we are to rid ourselves of the need to be the most powerful person in the room, because it doesn't allow us to be free. Like when we rid ourselves of this, we can actually have freedom to be us and to be authentically who we are. We're not trying to maintain anything. Now, while I agreed with what Mr. Desi said in this article, I still had a little bit of a problem with it. And if Chris was here today, I would ask him, well, I agree with what you're saying, but what or who is the example for this? Where do we take our cues for this? How do we do this? Because the human condition needs affirmation. We desire validation. Because of sin and our separation from God, there's a void there that has to be filled. And so we're constantly trying to fill. So how do we do this, Chris? Well, how is what you're saying sustainable? And I don't know what his answer would be, but I know what my answer would be. The only way is a relationship and followership with Jesus. I know followership is not really a word, but y'all stay with me here. Relationship and followership with Jesus. Because in Jesus, plus the gift he gave us in the Holy Spirit, which has come to lead us and guide us into all truth. So Jesus is the example. The Holy Spirit is the power that we have access to. That's how we can humble ourselves. That's how we can rid ourselves of trying to be of significance or the most powerful person in the room or whatever the case may be. And it's interesting when we think about this idea of followership. If we go back up to verse 13 and 14 in what we read, Jesus said, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are speaking rightly, since that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." And then verse 8, when he's responding to Peter, if I don't do this, you can't roll with me. If you don't let me do this and you don't do this, then you can't be a part of my kingdom. This is like this thing about humility. It ain't optional. It's not a nice thing to do. It's not, oh man, this is just, something to display no, this is not an option, is what Jesus is saying. And in the book Humility and Absolute Surrender by Andrew Murray, he says, make humility the first and most essential element of discipleship. And I love that Jesus said in John 5, I only do what I see the Father doing. That's where Jesus is taking his cue from. And we are to take our cue from Jesus. Every day we have opportunities to use power and influence. The scriptures tell us that life and death is in the power of the tongue. So even the words that you say have power and influence. We can stop right there. That's the opportunity every single day. So the question is that I want to leave you with, and I think this is what we need to take with us and chew on and process and let the Holy Spirit speak to us about what this means. What are you doing with your power and influence that you've been given? No matter how big, no matter how small, what are you doing with it? And just a second question to put in your back pocket. What or where are you taking your cue from? Because that's just as important. You've got the opportunity to have power and influence, but you got to take your cue and your influence from somewhere. When Jesus knew he was the most powerful person in the room, he intentionally humbled himself to be an example. And for those of us who follow Jesus or aspire to follow Jesus, we must be intentional in the same way.